Ricardo. Mark, we've heard you that the Portuguese problem is not a banking problem. That's probably much more complexity in it. That we have no fiscal space, we are cut from markets. That we should not be looking for free lunches and not be fighting the trolls that you put forward. So I would like to see if you could comment on some of these ideas, how this national perspective adds up to your narrative on the global problem.
I want to thank you all with being so diligent in sitting through people like me talking so much about this stuff. It can get a little tiring and also a little depressing, but I think that the insights which have been generated by each of my commentators are extremely valuable. And while there is no such thing as a free lunch, there is such a thing as a very late lunch. And I'm sure that many of you are looking forward to lunch. So I shall not spend a great deal of time. I will cut to the chase. If you have a look, can we get the second graph back up again? It's very important. I want to start with, and also being an American professor, despite my accent, if you don't mind, I will call you by your first names rather than professor. I'm in Berlin just now, and Herr Professor von Doctor gets very tiring after a while. So if I can begin with Ricardo's comments. This is tremendously important. Now, here's something very interesting. And I don't have a mic now, so I can't turn around, so I'll try and do it off this. If you have a look, why is Portugal so close to Latvia? Right? Because remember, Latvia is meant to be the success story in all this. So what is it that they have? What does that show you? Look along the x-axis at the bottom. That's a fantastic argument he's making here. Because basically what you have are countries that don't have a business model at the top. Latvia and Portugal effectively deindustrialized in the 1990s. One because the Soviets moved out and they left them with nothing. And the other one because your domestic industries were wiped out by Asian competition. And rather than actually have a hard conversation and figure out a new business model, all of that soft capital from the north came flooding into your banking system and basically postponed that decision for a decade until it all dried up. So there is a very solid reason that this is a very important point, which is you need a business model. Now here's where I disagree a little bit with this, and it falls to that fallacy of composition once again. You can't all run a surplus, and you can't all be Finland. And people have to not be Finland for Finland to exist. So the notion that we can all, in a sense, slide down that curve and get to that happy quadrant is a bit like saying, why can't we all be Sweden? And the reason we can't all be Sweden is because we can't all be Sweden. So I think that that kind of fallacy of composition still undermines this, even though I very much agree with the general thrust of the argument. I'd like now to turn to Theodora's extensive comments and make several comments on them myself. Let's stick with Sweden. I agree with pretty much everything that she has said. Again, I just want to put this into a wider canvas. Sweden went into the crisis with 35% debt to GDP. I think Spain went in with 36%. Ireland went in with half of that. Having fiscal space is a great thing, and absolutely we should have counter-cyclical policies. The problem is twofold. Number one, there are no such things as counter-cyclical politicians. So what you end up with, and this speaks very much to one of the issues that was raised as the fallacies here, there is no downside to the upside of an asset bubble for a democratic politician. Right? That's a simple fact. So you never get Keynesian politicians. The problem is not the economics. It's always been the politics that supposedly underlie it. Now, the second problem then, and this is perhaps what I would put it on a broader canvas, is even if the Portuguese banks themselves aren't in particular trouble, they're part of a network of highly indebted banks which all borrow in a currency that none of them control and lend across an entire continental space and are governed by one central bank, which from 2010 to 2011 was not doing its job. That means that effectively your yield spiked, not because of your lack of fiscal space, but because central bank policy wasn't credible. Now central bank policy is credible, at least for the medium term. I very much doubt if you allowed your deficit to increase by a few percentage points, you'd be frozen out of the markets again, because you put simply, your bonds are guaranteed by the ECB now because Draghi has made a promise, whereas that promise was not operative before. So I don't think you're really cut off from financing in this way. And I think that a little less sort of, let's say, slashing oneself for no apparent reason is probably a very good idea in that way. And that perhaps would give us that better fiscal space and better room for better social policies. Turning to Cesar's very provocative comments. As a Catholic myself, I recognize where the heart in this is coming from. I would also say, however, that we disagree on what the disease is. So for me, they're not trolls. It's not, you know, if everyone's a troll, there are no problems. There are just fictions. In which case, we have a very, very unusual situation going on because there's a lot of distress which is caused by a lot of fiction. So I just disagree on, as was said, for me, the problem is a too-big-to-bail banking sector, where, to anticipate some of the comments that were made, there's a huge rent-seeking operation going on, and when it goes wrong, everyone else is being asked to pay for it. In terms of the 5 fallacies, we certainly agree on some of them. The being born yesterday, I think, is absolutely spot on. And that's my version of that, is there's no such thing as counter-cyclical politicians. But I would say that there are free lunches. It depends on who you are. Some people get free lunches. Very, very wealthy people get free lunches all the time because they get their assets bailed out at public expense. So I would disagree on some of those points, but I very much appreciate the hard truths that you're trying to tell us about the choices that we need to make. Turning now to the issue of rent-seeking in the private sector, as was raised by Fiera. Yes, I think that is a very serious problem. First of all, the issue of internal devaluation as a substitute for external devaluation. Yeah, it's right, it's not a substitute, absolutely not. And these reflect long-term structural problems, and that graph speaks to this, in the sense that basically countries such as Portugal and Greece have a problem that was papered over by excess credit coming from the north for a long time, which is the basic business model in conditions of globalization no longer works. Now, when you get at, and this speaks to the notion of regime change, etc., what's really going on here is a regime change. That's probably true. It's probably not about austerity trying to cure budgets, because of course it's a banking problem, not a budget problem, at least in my interpretation. So why are we doing this? Because we need to change the business model. But this is when it becomes very complex. The job of changing the Portuguese business model is the job of the Portuguese. It's not the job of Brussels. And to basically walk around with a checklist, which is a dusted-off version of the Washington Consensus for reforming third-world economies, and get rid of the taxi driver's monopoly and get rid of the minimum wage, and somehow this is going to promote growth, that's not nearly good enough and is actually more destructive than it is constructive. So in that regard, yes, deep structural reform is absolutely needed, but that must be owned by the democracy in which those costs are going to be apportioned. They cannot be dictated from another country, particularly when there is no democratic representation to make one's voice heard fully outside the Commission and the Council, which are not democratic institutions. So I think there's a real problem there. And then finally, turning to the notions of excessive austerity and building on this notion of regime change, I will finish where I finished with my own talk on this one. And, you know, to me, the problem, to go back to Cesar again, is the notion of, you know, it's not a troll. There is a problem in the financial sector. And I'll give you 2 reasons I think this is the case. 40% of my students every year go into the financial sector, which constitutes 10% of the economy, and at the height of the Troubles was generating 40% of all corporate profits across the Anglo-American banking sphere. Their rewards are 10 times that of anyone else. And when you have an incentive structure built into a banking institution, which is the following, it says, if you lose money, you can keep your job, so long as everybody else loses money. If you don't make money when everyone else is making money, you will lose your job. And if you make money when everybody else is making money, you'll keep your job. This creates a herd mentality amongst people who know that they're never going to get a better offer than this because they're earning 10 times what everyone else is. And they will hold on to that no matter what. Now, the best way of doing this is to create a system of banks that are so big that they can never internalize the externalities that they create. Andy Haldane calls this the Fukushima problem. So just as Tokyo Electric Power can never take on the costs of cleaning up the mess that they created, we have a system of banks across Europe and indeed across the developed world, whereby they're all little Fukushimas waiting to happen. And if I own a little Fukushima, that means my cost of capital gets subsidized, and at the end of the day, I can do an extortion racket against taxpayers. And it also means an enormous talent diversion, because that 40% of my students who go into finance are some of the smartest kids that there are. And what should we be doing with our engineers? They should be moving us further down that curve, instead of which they're making more and more complex derivatives to screw each other in a zero-sum game. That's why I don't think they're trolls. I think it's a problem. Thank you.